The receiving line at Priya's wedding moved slowly, the way receiving lines always do when the family is large and everyone feels obligated to say something meaningful to people they see twice a year at best. I had been standing in it for 20 minutes, still in my surgical scrubs under a blazer I had grabbed from my car, when my cousin Deepak noticed me from across the marble foyer and said something to the woman beside him. She laughed. I didn't hear what he said. I didn't need to. I had known Deepak for 31 years, which is my entire life, and I knew the particular angle of his head when he was being entertaining at someone else's expense. His wife Sunita covered her mouth with her hand in the way people do when they want to appear politely restrained, while also making sure you register that they are laughing. I kept moving forward in the line. The wedding was at the Meridian Grand in the center of Birmingham, the kind of venue that charges by the hour for the car park and has a concierge who pretends not to notice when guests are underdressed. My cousin Priya was marrying a man named Karan, whose family had flown in from 3 different countries, and the guest list included people whose names I recognized from business pages and one retired politician whose presence had apparently required a separate security conversation with the venue. It was, by any measure, an occasion that announced itself. Mum kanain says a didirunyawanin beatin nolkambly. I was wearing scrubs because I had come directly from a 9-hour shift. My name is Dr. Sonal Mehta. I am a consultant vascular surgeon at Queen's Central Hospital, which is 12 minutes by car from the Meridian Grand on a good day, and on the day of Priya's wedding it had taken me 19 because of roadworks on the ring road. I had been on call since 6 in the morning. The case that had kept me late was a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm, a patient in his 60s who had arrived by ambulance in a state that suggested he had perhaps an hour of stable physiology remaining, possibly less. We had operated for just over 4 hours. He was in the ICU when I left, which was the best outcome available for that particular presentation, and it was enough. I had called my mother from the car park to say I would be late. How late? She said. I'm leaving now. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Sonal, a pause. You're not going to change? I don't have anything to change into. Another pause, longer. Your Auntie Sunita will notice. Auntie Sunita notices everything, I said. I'll be there in 20 minutes. What I hadn't anticipated, what I had not fully accounted for in the arithmetic of arriving late to a large family wedding in surgical scrubs, was the receiving line. I had thought I would slip in during dinner, find my table, and manage the evening without drawing particular attention. The receiving line put me in the center of the foyer in front of approximately 60 people, many of whom I knew, and several of whom were looking at me with expressions that ranged from sympathy to curiosity to the specific delight that some people feel when a social situation provides them with material. Deepak materialized at my elbow before I reached the front of the line. Sonal, he said. Scrubs. At a black tie wedding, that's a choice. He said it loudly enough for the people immediately around us to hear. He had always had that quality, a social volume that he deployed strategically, so that his observations reached exactly the audience he intended without appearing to be announcements. I came from work, I said. Right, the hospital. He said it the way people sometimes say the name of a place they have never been and don't intend to visit. Couldn't you have kept a change of clothes in the car, for occasions? I'll keep that in mind for next time, I said. Sunita had joined us. She looked at my blazer, a navy one I'd had in the car for approximately 3 months, and which had a small crease along the left lapel, and then at my scrub trousers, and then back up at my face with an expression of practiced concern. You must be exhausted, she said, working these hours. It's so hard on the body, isn't it? It was phrased as sympathy and delivered as something else. I had known Sunita for 12 years, since she married Deepak, and in that time I had developed a reasonable understanding of the gap between what she said and what she communicated. I'm fine, I said. It was a long case, but the patient came through. Oh good, she said, already looking past me. The thing about Deepak and Sunita, and about that particular branch of my family more generally, is that they were not cruel people in a simple sense. Deepak was charming. He was genuinely funny, in the way that people are funny when they are intelligent and socially gifted, and have never had to develop much empathy because the world has rarely required it of them. His family had money from 3 generations back, the kind that becomes invisible because it simply is the texture of life rather than something acquired. He had gone into finance, done well, and lived in a house in Solihull that had a name rather than a number. My family had not come from that branch. My father was Deepak's father's younger brother, the brother who had immigrated with less, worked in a factory for the first 6 years, and built a life that was stable and decent and ordinary. I had grown up in a semi-detached in Wolverhampton. I had done my homework at the kitchen table. I had gotten into medical school through grades and the particular stubbornness that comes from wanting something in a household where wanting things required you to justify them. Deepak and I had grown up alongside each other in the way that cousins do when the families maintain a connection across different circumstances, present at all the significant occasions, fond in the vague way that shared history produces, but never quite on the same terrain. He had always been slightly amused by me, and I had always been slightly outside whatever it was he considered the relevant category of success. When I had gotten into medical school, my uncle Harish, Deepak's father, had said at a family dinner, kindly and genuinely, "A doctor, good for her. It's steady work." There was nothing offensive in it. It was simply that in that family the ceiling of aspiration was elsewhere, and medicine was something that decent people from the other branch did. When I had chosen surgery, and then vascular surgery specifically, which is one of the more demanding subspecialties, Deepak had said, at another family occasion, "Don't they have robots for that now?" And laughed, and the table had laughed, and I had smiled because I was 26 and still learning how to hold my ground in a room without making it a confrontation. I had not become a surgeon because of Deepak. That would give him too much credit for a decision that belonged entirely to me. I had become a surgeon because I had stood in an operating theater during my 3rd year of medical school and watched a vascular consultant repair a damaged artery in a patient who would otherwise have lost a limb, and something in the precision of it, the combination of anatomical knowledge and physical skill and genuine consequence, had identified itself to me as the thing I wanted to spend my working life doing. The decision was that simple and that complete. The training was neither. My surgical registrar years were the hardest period of my professional life, and I want to be direct about that rather than smooth it into a narrative of relentless progress. Surgical training in the UK is long. The period from qualifying as a doctor to becoming a consultant in a surgical specialty is routinely a decade or more, and vascular surgery is not a forgiving subspecialty in terms of either the intellectual demands or the physical ones. The cases are high stakes in a particular and unambiguous way. Vascular emergencies do not give you time to be uncertain for long. In my 3rd year of registrar training, I made a clinical decision that I have thought about many times since. A patient presented with symptoms that could have indicated 2 different things. I made a call that turned out to be correct, but the margin had been closer than I was comfortable with afterward. And my supervising consultant, a man named Mr. Gareth Obi, who was demanding in the way that good surgical trainers are demanding, sat with me for an hour after the case and worked through my reasoning in a way that was rigorous and uncomfortable, and, ultimately, the most useful single conversation of my training. He did not tell me I was wrong. He told me I had been right for slightly incomplete reasons, and that I needed to understand the difference. I have carried that distinction through every complex case since. I became a consultant at 33. The appointment process for NHS consultant posts is competitive and lengthy, and I had applied to 2 posts before being appointed to Queen's Central, which was where I had wanted to be, a large hospital, a busy vascular unit, a case mix that would keep me challenged. My clinical director at the time of my appointment was a woman named Mr. Singh. She used the surgical honorific Mr. as women consultants in surgery sometimes do and sometimes don't, and she used it with a particular ease that I admired, who told me at my first appraisal that my technical skills were strong and that my instinct for prioritization under pressure was something she had not seen consistently in trainees younger than 40. I was 33. I did not say this. I thanked her and went back to work. The wedding dinner was already in progress when the receiving line finally ended. I found my table, which was populated by a mixture of people I knew slightly and people I knew well, and I ate quickly because I was genuinely hungry. The last thing I had eaten had been a sandwich at 11 in the morning, and I deflected the questions about my outfit with practiced brevity. My mother sat 2 tables away and kept glancing at me with an expression that was split equally between concern and the resigned affection she had developed over 3 decades of being my mother. Deepak had been seated at the main family table. From across the room I could see him in conversation, commanding his corner of the table with the easy authority of someone entirely comfortable in the setting. He caught my eye once and gave me a small nod that I returned, and that was the extent of our interaction for the first 2 hours of the dinner. The evening program included speeches, which ran long, and then a transition to dancing, and then, this is the part I had not known was planned, a formal acknowledgement of distinguished guests by the host family. Priya's new father-in-law, a man named Mr. Anand Kapoor, stood at the front of the room and thanked various people in the way that wedding hosts do, and I was finishing a conversation with my aunt about something entirely unrelated when I heard a name, Mr. Anand Kapoor. I had not connected the name when I heard it during the ceremony. It is not an uncommon name, but standing at the front of the room, I now recognized the face. Anand Kapoor was the chairman of the Hospital Trust Board at Queen's Central. I had met him formally twice, once at an all-staff leadership briefing and once at a clinical governance event where I had presented on outcomes data from our vascular unit. Both occasions had been professional and brief. He was a man in his late 60s with a background in healthcare administration, and he took the role seriously in the way that the best board chairs do, engaged with clinical quality rather than retreating purely into financial governance. He had recognized me before I fully recognized him. I could see it in the slight change in his attention as he scanned the room during his speech, a brief pause when his eyes reached my table, and then a decision that I watched happen in real time. "Before I finish," he said, "I want to acknowledge someone who I didn't expect to see this evening, and whose presence here is entirely explained by the fact that she apparently came directly from saving a man's life this afternoon." The room shifted, 300 people rearranging their attention. "Queen's Central is my hospital in the sense that I chair its board," he said. "But it is genuinely the hospital it is because of people like our consultant vascular surgeon, who performed emergency surgery today on a patient who would not have survived without her, and who then drove here because this is also her family, Dr. Sonal Mehta." The applause started before I had fully processed what was happening. I stood because it seemed the appropriate response, and because sitting would have been stranger. I was wearing surgical scrubs and a creased navy blazer. I was aware of this. I was also aware of the room. 300 people, most of whom had not known my name 10 seconds ago, and I was aware, specifically, of Deepak's table, which was close enough that I could see his face without looking directly at it. He had stopped mid-sentence in whatever conversation he had been having. His wife Sunita had turned in her chair. Both of them were looking at me with expressions I can only describe as recalibration. The visible process of updating a file that had been stored under one heading and suddenly needed to be moved somewhere else entirely. Kapoor gestured for me to come forward, which I had not expected and which meant I had to walk across the room in scrubs in front of 300 people. I did it. There was no other available option. He shook my hand at the front of the room and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "I apologize for ambushing you. Priya's mother told me the story when I arrived. I hope it's all right." "It's fine," I said. And I meant it. He turned back to the room for a moment. "This is what doctors actually do," he said simply. "And I think it's worth knowing who they are." I went back to my table. The applause continued for a few seconds, and then the evening reassembled itself, the way evenings do, into movement and music and conversation. My mother found me within 3 minutes, which is faster than she usually moves through a crowd, and she held my arm with both hands and didn't say anything for a moment, which is unusual for her. "He knew who you were," she said finally. "He's the trust chairman," I said. "He should probably know his consultants. He said you saved someone's life today. That's what the job is." She looked at me. "I know," she said. "I know it is." Deepak came to find me later, during the dancing portion of the evening. He had a glass of whiskey in his hand and the particular expression of a man who is approaching a conversation he hasn't entirely prepared for. "I didn't know," he said, "that he was Priya's father-in-law." "I didn't either. You should have said something when I made the comment earlier." I considered this. What would I have said? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at his glass, then back at me. "I've been doing that," he said. "The thing I did earlier, for a long time, making you the—" He stopped. "I thought I was just taking the piss, you know, the way cousins do." "I know," I said. "Was it—" He stopped again. "It accumulated," I said. "That's all. It accumulated. He nodded slowly. This was, I think, as close to an apology as Deepak knew how to construct in real time, and I recognized it for what it was, rather than what it wasn't. I didn't perform forgiveness. I didn't give him a speech about what the years had cost me, or a list of occasions and their impact, partly because the whiskey and the wedding venue were not the right conditions for that conversation, and partly because I had realized some time ago that I didn't actually carry the weight of his opinions in the way I once had. They had mattered when I was younger, when I was still working out whether the version of me reflected in his amusement was the accurate one or the distorted one. They had stopped mattering sometime around my 4th year as a consultant, when the daily reality of the work had become so fully the substance of my identity that there was no longer much space for someone else's assessment to occupy. He was not a bad person. He was a man who had never had to think very carefully about the cost of his carelessness, because the people on the receiving end had always been polite enough not to present him with the bill. That is a specific kind of blindness, and it is not the same as cruelty, and I was not going to stand in a wedding venue and deliver him a reckoning over a glass of whiskey. "Go back to your table," I said. "It's Priya's night." He went. I stayed until 11, which is later than I had planned. My patient in the ICU was stable. I had checked twice from the bathroom. My mother danced with my aunts to a song from a film we had all seen as children, and I watched from the edge of the floor with a glass of water and felt something quiet and uncomplicated that I don't have a precise word for. Relief, maybe, or just the particular satisfaction of a day that had contained both very hard things and ordinary good ones, and had held them both without either canceling the other out. I drove home along the ring road with the windows slightly open. The roadworks were still there, but the traffic had thinned. I thought about my patient, about the specific decision point in the operation where the anatomy had been more complicated than the imaging had suggested, and the 30 seconds I had spent making a choice that could not be revised once made, and the clean certainty I had felt at the moment of making it. Not arrogance, just the settled knowledge of someone who has spent years preparing for exactly this kind of moment. That knowledge had not come from being acknowledged at a wedding. It had not come from Deepak's sudden recalibration or from Mr. Kapoor's generous introduction. It had come from the operating theater, from Mr. Obi's hour-long debrief about incomplete reasoning, from the long years of training that nobody in my extended family had ever really wanted to hear about because the details were technical and the timeline was unglamorous, and there was no good story in it, until suddenly, from the outside, there was. The scrubs are still in my car, folded on the back seat. I keep a change of clothes in the boot now, not because Deepak suggested it, but because it is practically sensible, and because I have learned to separate advice that is useful from the spirit in which it was offered. My patient was discharged 17 days after the operation. I reviewed him in outpatient 6 weeks later. He walked in under his own power, which is not something I take for granted in cases that begin the way his did. He shook my hand and said thank you, and I said the team had done good work, which was true. He asked how I was. Good, I said. Tired. He smiled. Good tired or bad tired? Good, I said. Definitely good.